Two science fiction tales by Robert Bloch. The author is known mostly for his horror and mystery stories, but those selected for this reading lean more into science fiction. The first story is called The Learning Maze and was first published in an anthology which was named for it in 1974. It was then reprinted in a collection of the author's stories 3 years later entitled Cold Chills, as well as The Best of Robert Bloch, also released in 1977. The second story, How Like a God, first appeared in the April 1969 issue of Galaxy magazine, and then again in both Cold Chills and The Best of, and it is from that last that each are now read. Read by Darrell T. Smith II for my channel, Quasar Spectra. The Learning Maze. John couldn't remember a time when he hadn't been in the maze. He must have been very young at first, because his earliest recollection was a confused impression of lying on his back and sucking greedily from a tube extended by a feeder. The feeder, of course, was a servo mechanism, but John didn't realize that until much later. At the time, he was only aware of the tall tangle of moving metal hovering over him and extending a hollow tentacle toward his eager lips. There had been a changer, too, approaching him at regular intervals to remove soiled clothing, cleanse his body, and cover it with fresh garments. John's memories became more vivid as his areas of perception slowly extended. The first unit of the maze was a vast enclosure in which hundreds of infants lay in their individual plastic life support units, while the feeders and changers moved amongst them. From time to time, another type of servo mechanism appeared without warning, disturbing the regular rhythm of eating, sleeping, and elimination by superimposing its bulk upon his body. Now John realized it must have been a mechanism, but he still thought of it as a spider, a gigantic insectoid creature straddling him on extended silvery legs as its myriad extra appendages poked and probed the organs and orifices of his body. It recorded pulse, respiration, brainwave patterns, and his entire metabolism, and corrected deficiencies by injection. John could still remember the sting of the needles and how he had writhed and screamed. Naturally, he'd feared and hated the process. Even now that he knew the whole procedure was impersonal and computer-directed for his welfare and well-being, he still resented it. The other infants had screamed too, but not everything was that unpleasant. As time passed, they began to move around more freely, aided by hand grips within their cubicles, and then they started to crawl. John crawled with them, eventually leaving the shelter of the life support unit to seek the source of sounds and images beyond. The sounds and images came from the walls, from the closed-circuit televisor screens. The screens sang soothingly to him at night, and by day they showed images of other infants crawling and feeding happily. Watching the screens, John and his peer group began to imitate the actions of the images. Soon they learned to take nourishment from little sterile containers deposited by the feeders at regular intervals once the tubes were no longer offered. Some of John's companions cried when the tubes disappeared, but in time they all began to eat what was set before them. They began the educational process, and that, of course, was the real function of the learning maze, to teach them how to live and grow. In the antiseptic atmosphere of the chamber, with its controlled temperature and humidity levels, they watched the infant images on the screens as the figures crawled, and then stood erect and took their first faltering steps. Imitating them, John started to walk. Soon all the others were walking, exploring the chamber and one another. Touch, bodily contact, the discovery and awareness of differences and similarities, sexual awakening, all of this was a part of learning. The maze guarded and waited, and when the time came, its screens disappeared into the walls, and there was only a doorway visible at the far end of the chamber. Through that doorway, John could glimpse another chamber beyond, filled with other youngsters larger than himself, who walked freely without falling and uttered complicated sounds as they pursued fascinating, glittering objects in bigger and brighter surroundings. At first, John merely watched, uncertain and afraid. Then, inevitably, came an urge to move through the doorway. There was no barrier, no impediment, and he entered easily into the adjoining section of the maze. Here, the individual plastic cubicles were larger and the screens more sophisticated in their offerings. They still sang soothingly at night, but by day they talked to him. Night was dark and day was light. That was one of the first things John learned. Even before he could understand the words, John learned many things. He learned to dispense with the feeders and changers because here the servo mechanisms were different. Their metallic shapes roughly resembled his own on a larger scale. They had arms and legs and heads, and they moved about almost in the same fashion that he did. Only, of course, mechanisms never seemed to tire or express emotion. Perhaps that's why they had no faces, merely a blank surface meshed over the front of their heads through which voices filtered instructions and commands. Gradually, John began to understand the voices, whether they issued from the screens or from the servo mechanisms, and presently he learned to respond and to answer in kind. Soon, John was established in a normal pattern of boyhood. He played with the glittering objects, the educational toys, which tested and extended physical strength, improved his motor reflexes and coordination, and taught him mechanical dexterity and skills. He talked to his companions, all of whom were males. He made friends and enemies, embarked upon the give and take of social relationships, rivalries, and dependencies. Competition provided him with motivation. He wanted to excel in order to attract attention and approval. John's orientation came from the screens. As he grew older, he became aware of the world beyond, the real world outside the learning maze. The world which had once existed without mazes of any sort, and in which human beings had lived all their lives with only the crudest kind of servo mechanisms to help them. History, or their story, as it was now correctly called, dealt with the quaint quality of this primitive culture in which the biological parents undertook the education of their offspring, assisted by crude instructional institutions. The combined effects of emotional conflict and ignorance had their inevitable effect. The world had been plunged into endless warfare in which both the inhabitants and their natural environment were almost totally destroyed. Then, and only then, the learning maze concept came to the rescue. Once a mere toy for the study of animal behavior in old-fashioned laboratories, then a simple experimental device developed for the psychological conditioning of children in a few universities. The learning maze principle had been expanded to bring true sanity and civilization to mankind. The perfection of various types of servo mechanisms, completely controlled by computerization, eliminated all error. Gone was the outmoded human hierarchy of masters and servants that had created destruction. Today, these roles were played by machines, and man was free to fulfill his true function, learning how to live. John soon realized that his only problem was how to avoid pitfalls along the way, because there were pitfalls in the learning maze. Although the surface beneath his feet seemed solid and substantial, it could give way. He'd seen it happen. Not all his companions learned as quickly as he did. Some of them seemed uninterested in watching the screens and absorbing the information they provided. If this indifference persisted, the servo mechanisms noted it and took action. The action was simple and direct, but startlingly effective. The mechanism merely focused its blank-faced attention on a lazy or non-competitive youngster and then, with a quick gesture, reached up and pulled a switch located at the side of its metal head. Suddenly, without warning, the ground directly under the child parted, and he fell into the dark opening below. Sometimes there was a scream, but usually it happened too quickly for that. For in an instant, the gaping hole was gone again, as though it and the child it had swallowed no longer existed. No one ever discovered what happened to those who disappeared, and neither the screens nor the servo mechanisms offered any explanation. John's companions couldn't find any physical evidence pointing to the exact location of the pitfalls. They seemed to be completely camouflaged and scattered at random all over the maze, so there was no way in which to avoid them. There were all sorts of guesses, but no one really knew it, and was better not to think too much about it. The important thing was to realize the danger existed and could confront one at any time. Pulling the switch was the punishment for not learning, for being unable to learn, and for being too sick or too weak or too helpless to learn. But learning brought rewards, because now, once again, another doorway appeared leading to an area beyond. Peering through it, John could see a new vista of the maze, expanded and elaborate, filled with evidence of exciting activity. The screens told him about that activity, about males and females and the pleasure of their relationships. The responses of his own body affirmed the truth of what he was told. John and his companions were anxious to enter that next section and enter into its activities, but when they attempted to move through, an invisible barrier prevented their progress. "Not yet," said the voices from the screens. "You must learn more before you're ready." Impatiently, John and the others looked and listened, but their inner awareness was concentrated on the delights beyond the doorway. From time to time, someone would desert his learning post and steal away towards the other chamber, but always a servo mechanism barred his path and uttered a warning. If ignored, the mechanism pulled its switch and the heedless one dropped down to disappear. But there were moments when John and his fellows were unobserved, and then they would steal up to the opening to stare at the scene beyond and to test the invisible force field of the barrier. Eventually, they grew stronger, or the barrier became weaker. Finally, one by one, they broke through. And there, in the next segment of the maze, John and the others found their females. Pairing off, they sought still larger cubicles to share with their partners, and the pattern of existence changed. John's partner was called Ava. It was she who now prepared the food left by the servo mechanisms who ministered to the needs of this section. At first, John was not too greatly interested in food, but as time passed and the novelty of physical contact waned, nourishment and comfort became more important again. Once more, John learned the pattern of rewards and punishments governing this area of the maze. Food was distributed only to those who were willing to spend time watching the screens. Since Ava seemed completely absorbed in the day-to-day routine of life within their cubicle, John was forced to appear regularly before a screen as further lessons in living were presented. The images were quite diversified and complex now. There were scenes of full-grown adults engaging in a great variety of activities. Some seemed to be full-time screen watchers. Some appeared to ignore the screens and devote themselves to tests of strength with companions, rivaling them for the interest of females. John was not tired of Ava, but he found himself studying various techniques of competition with increasing interest. It would appear that in the real world he was preparing to enter, the biggest and strongest acquired the best cubicles, and the most attractive females. In addition, they received the envy and admiration of their companions. The more John learned, the more interested he became in testing his own powers. Ava's simple responses began to bore him. She wasn't concerned with what he told her about the real world beyond and couldn't understand why he was dissatisfied to stay here forever. But John was tired of the tedium of screen watching and apprehensive about the fate of his fellows who balked. He had seen them deprived of food by the servo mechanisms for neglecting their daily duties. Some of those who were content to become completely absorbed in relationships with their partners had already disappeared. There seemed to be no penalty for the females. Their limited interests didn't stamp them as inferior, for their previous conditioning had obviously been different. But the males were obligated to continue the learning process, and John knew he must comply. Besides, a new opening had appeared in the far wall of the chamber, and now he found himself moving forward to gaze into the next complex beyond. John knew, without being told, that this must be the real world, the world for which he'd prepared to dwell in during all this period of study and growth. What waited beyond the invisible barrier was not a simple chamber, but a huge series of corridors, each with an opening which afforded a partial, tantalizing glimpse of activity within. Others, like himself, prowled these corridors, entering various compartments at will and exiting to move along into still other portions of the maze. John could not see any screens on the corridor walls, and that was good. Here, men seemed to be living, not learning. They were coupling with many females, carrying huge accumulations of food and clothing from one place to another, trading and exchanging various articles, and fighting off others who attempted to take a portion for themselves without permission or barter agreements. John couldn't wait to join them, and when he crowded up to the opening, he found himself passing through without hindrance and without a thought of Ava left behind him. Ava, with her dull conversation, her duller caresses, and her swollen belly. Once across the barrier, John forgot Ava completely. There was so much to see, so much to do, for this tangle of corridors stretched off endlessly in all directions, opening upon many types of rooms and rooms within rooms, but it was still a part of the maze. From what he'd seen on the outside, John had thought there would be no more screens. Now he realized he was mistaken, for if anything, their numbers had increased. The difference was that there was no longer any uniformity to the images on the screens or the messages they imparted. Pausing at a chamber doorway, John could hear some voices from the screens urging him to enter, promising him all sorts of rewards and describing the pleasures of participation in the activities within. Other voices, equally shrill and urgent, warned him to keep out, to seek still more distant rooms. The servo mechanisms were here too, though less noticeable, for now they more closely resembled John's living companions. They moved naturally, their gestures were less stiff and more assured. Their voices rang with confident authority. At first, John wasn't even able to identify them as mechanisms because they were masked in faces simulating flesh, faces that smiled benevolently, grinned confidently, or frowned sternly. "Follow me," they said, and John joined the group obediently to be led into a bewildering array of vast arena-like enclosures. In one such place, a leader gathered together all those with fair complexions, while another assembled those with darker skins. From the walls, the screens screamed at both groups in turn, exciting them with alternate threats and promises, urging them to destroy their opposites. The noise was ceaseless, the confusion incredible, and in the struggle that followed, the leaders stood aside, observing. When one of John's companions slackened, the inevitable gesture was made. A hand went to the side of the head, and one of the invisible seams opened to engulf the offender. It was only then that John realized the leaders were servomechanisms, for when the switches operated, the masks sometimes slipped to one side, and John could see the blank, featureless surface beneath, totally devoid of any resemblance to humanity. That was when John fought his way through the struggling throng and escaped into a corridor, only to be swept along into another area where the chief activity seemed to be the removal of metal discs affixed to the walls of the chamber. Here, the screens displayed glittering panoplies of such discs, while their voices extolled the glory of gathering them together and heaping them up into huge piles. According to the screens, great skill and intelligence were required to perform this feat, and there was no higher goal than the acquisition and arrangement of discs. As if to prove the point, large numbers of exotically dressed youthful females prowled about, inspecting the heaps and offering themselves to those who had managed to accumulate the largest portions. But John observed that the females seldom stayed long with any one accumulator. They always seemed attracted by another collector with a still larger heap. John also noted that obtaining the discs was not an easy procedure. Prying them from their fastenings in the walls was a painful task, which made the fingers bleed. Sometimes rival disc gatherers fought with one another over the discovery of a fresh cluster of discs, and many times they resorted to stealing discs from the collections of their companions. Indeed, it seemed as if the most truly imposing amounts were gathered in just this way, by theft alone. Wrenching discs free from the walls was more exhausting and a much slower process. Sometimes it was necessary to stand on tiptoe for those beyond reach, or to crouch to burrow at the very base of the walls. Yet there was a strange compulsive element involved. Those who toiled eventually became so absorbed that they could not even be distracted by the young, nubile females, and even food and slumber seemed unimportant. Similarly, the thieves came to devote themselves solely to stealing, with equally tiring results. When the efforts slackened or ceased through utter exhaustion, their servo mechanisms appeared, pushing aside their sober masks to pull the switch. Thus, disc gatherers and disc stealers alike disappeared, leaving only a shining heap as a memento of existence, a heap that was immediately plundered by waiting rivals. But these were only two of the many areas which John discovered in the maze. There was a shouting section, he could think of it in no other terms, in which every occupant was encouraged to drown out the voices of his fellows and reduce them to the status of listeners. Here, the rivals emulated the voices from the screens, uttering promises, blandishments, flattery, and exhortations, while at the same time denouncing the words of all the others in a continuous effort to attract the less articulate to support their stated purposes. At first, John tried to listen, but the more he heard, the more confused he became. Some praised those who fought in the arena sections, some denounced them, some extolled the virtues of disc accumulators, and others derided. But in the end, their voices hoarsened and failed, and their audiences turned away to hear the same messages couched in slightly different phrases by younger and louder voices. When this happened, a servo mechanism appeared to seek out the speechless orator, deserted by all, and to make the inevitable movement towards the side of the head. In another area, John found speakers equally dedicated to attracting followers, but using softer and more persuasive tones. They spoke of the great secret of the learning maze, the secret that had been imparted to them as a special dispensation. Praising the voices from the screens, they explained that the commands and injunctions issuing from them were often cryptic and mysterious and had to be interpreted by speakers such as themselves in order that all might understand. However, each speaker seemed to have a different explanation of the meaning of the maze, its creation, its purpose, and how one must conduct oneself within it. Each speaker disputed the statements of his fellows, even to the minor points of words and phrases used by them, so that, in the end, the soft voices gave way to angry shouts, denunciations, threats of endless punishment, and commands to destroy all those who refused to agree without question. The speaker would always call upon the servo mechanisms to punish and eliminate the non-believers. Some of the talk interested John at the beginning, for he had often tried to figure out the program of the maze, but when talk gave way to outcry, it became incoherent and bewildering. John noted that the servo mechanisms never came upon a command to destroy the speaker's enemies. Only when all the prayers for vengeance died did the mechanisms finally appear to make the gesture which removed speakers and followers alike. In the end, no one who stayed in this chamber was spared, whatever his beliefs. John remembered a section where all occupants seemed to be engaged in an endless and complicated measurement process. Dedicated to observation, they gravely calculated the area of the room, analyzed and tabulated the components of the atmosphere within it, and even attempted to measure one another. These observers took great pride in their efforts and loudly proclaimed their superiority to those in other sections of the maze. Someday, they asserted, they would take their rightful place as the rulers of the maze once they had mastered all its secrets by their methods of measurement. What was not readily described in terms of size or mass or velocity of movement, they theorized about, paying particular attention to the phenomena of the wall screens and servo mechanisms, and attempting to fully explain their functions and purposes. But no two theories were exactly alike, and new measurements and methods of measurement constantly superseded the old, so that the end result was once again argument and anger. With all of the careful devotion to the accumulation of data and all of the energy expended in expounding theory, the room itself remained fixed and unchanged, except in minor details. Its occupants never left it until one of the servo mechanisms, its function still unfathomable despite all the hypotheses, made the final motion that put an end to further inquiry. Again, John refused to become completely involved in such activity and sought out other sections. There was a new arena where the young seemed to be pitted against the old, each denouncing the other for a greedy and self-centered attempt to take control. But as the young became older, they seemed to switch allegiance, and this so confused John that he was impelled to move on. In another place, food and sex and accumulation appeared unimportant to the occupants. They lay in a drugged stupor, oblivious to their surroundings except for the times when the screens flickered wildly and projected flashes of unrecognizable imagery or assaulted them with screaming sounds. Occasionally, a few of the group would rouse long enough to imitate what they saw or heard, painting weird squiggles upon canvas and even upon their own bodies, or plucking crude instruments to which they wailed accompaniment. What they sang and shouted made little sense to those who were not drugged like themselves. Eventually they relapsed into a mumbling preoccupation, gazing raptly at their faces in tiny mirrors that distorted their features beyond recognition until they came to resemble hairy beasts. Servo mechanisms moved to those sunk in the deepest stupor, and their switches were swift. John continued on, vaguely conscious that he was gradually coming to know the various routes and recesses of the maze. Eventually, he came upon a room that seemed more inviting than the others, even though the servo mechanism posted at the doorway did not urge him to enter. Perhaps it was this that attracted him, or the fact that the mechanism wore a different mask. In place of human features, there was only a surface emblazoned with a symbol. John recognized the curlicue and dot as something he'd seen on a screen long ago. A question mark. Intrigued, he glanced into the room of silence. A few men sat cross-legged on the floor, gazing at screens that were utterly blank and from which issued only a faint, deep drone. The drone was somehow soothing, but those who listened did not seem to be drugged or sleeping, merely contemplative. Weary of walking, weary of peering and puzzling, John moved into the chamber. Almost automatically, he sank down and assumed the cross-legged position, staring up at a screen. For a moment it seemed that he could see into the emptiness to catch a fleeting glimpse of something beyond. And wasn't there a voice whispering within the drone? Concentrating with all his being, John strained to see, to hear, but the more he tried, the less he perceived, for such exertion only made him conscious of himself. He finally relaxed, and then it came. Making no attempt to see, he saw. Making no effort to hear, he heard. But the vision and voice came from within, and suddenly they blended into revelation. For the first time, John understood the learning maze. Completely computerized, completely controlled, it was a reasoned reproduction of the past, mankind's past, in all its aspects, recapitulated in physical form. These were the lifestyles constructed by men in the real world long ago, and which they had followed to their own destruction. Those who sought sensory stimulation to the exclusion of all else were doomed. Those who pursued power, those who concentrated upon accumulating meaningless tokens of ownership, those who fought one another over differences in appearance or belief, were destined for extinction. Preoccupation with data or theory for its own sake was self-defeating. The distortion of phenomena by means of theology, pharmacology, or art was meaningless. All activity, all inquiry, all self-scrutiny and self-indulgence had its place in the scheme of things, but only in moderation and only as means to an end. The purpose of the maze was to teach by precept and example, to pinpoint the pitfalls endangering men in their ancestral past and their own individual futures. It illustrated the myriad facets of existence and illuminated the dangers of surrendering wholly to any one phase of behavior in its extreme. The whole man knew and experienced life as a whole, but never gave himself completely to a fraction, only to totality. In its system of rewards and punishment, the learning maze eliminated the weak and unfit from among those seeking to journey through it and emerge into the real world beyond. Even contemplation such as this could become a self-limiting and self-destructive thing. Awareness was granted for a purpose, for use in actual living. It was time now to leave the maze, and at last John knew the way. When he emerged from contemplation and left the quiet drone of the chamber, he no longer hesitated. The method was so simple once one grasped it. These rooms were only blind alleys set to trap the unaware. It was the corridor itself that was important. All he had to do was concentrate upon its convolutions and follow the path to the outer portals. There was no longer any need to pause or peer or participate. He had experienced enough of the chambers so that his curiosity was no longer aroused by them. Now he was free to direct his footsteps towards the greater goal. It was almost as though instinct had taken over, finding the proper route for him. Ignoring sham and semblance, he moved towards substance and reality. He came to a point where the twisted passageways merged into a single continuous corridor leading straight upwards. Now, directly ahead of him, John could see the actual opening and the light beyond, not the artificial light of the caverns, but the light of reality. He hastened towards it, toiling up the steep slant with renewed resolution. There was no obstacle now, nothing to impede his progress. A servo mechanism loomed up before him at the very threshold, but John's pace did not slacken. He pressed forward, purposeful and determined, his body weary, but his voice firm with resolve. "Let me pass," he commanded. The mechanism stood motionless, its featureless face staring, seeming to question without speaking. John, sensing the question, voiced his answer. "Why? Because I've had enough of faceless authority, of artificial motivation, meaningless routine, and still more meaningless change. I've learned all you can teach me here. Now I'm ready to live in the real world." "But you have lived all your life in the real world," said the mechanism softly. "Try to understand." John tried, but there wasn't much time, because the mechanism was already pulling the switch. How like a god. To be was sweet. There was meditation, a turning in upon oneself. There was contemplation, a turning out to regard others and otherness. In meditation, one remained contained. In contemplation, there was a merging, a coalescence with the rest. Mach preferred meditation. Here, Mach enjoyed identity and was conscious of being he, she, or it, endlessly repeated through the memory of millenniums of incarnations. Mach, like the others, had evolved through many life forms on many worlds. Now Mach was free of the pain and free of the pleasure, too, free of the illusions of the senses which had served the bodies housing the beings which finally became Mach. And yet Mach was not wholly free, because Mach still turned to the memories for satisfaction. The others preferred contemplation. They enjoyed coalescing, mingling their memories, pooling their awareness, and sharing their sense of being. Mach could never share completely. Mach was too conscious of the differences, for even without body, without sex, without physical limitation imposed by substance in time and space, Mach was aware of inequality. Mach was aware of Ser. Ser was the mightiest of them all. In coalescence, Ser's being dominated every pattern of contemplation. Ser's will imposed harmony on the others, but only if the others surrendered to it. To be was sweet, but it was not sweet enough. Upon this, Mach meditated, and when coalescence came again, Mach did not surrender. Mach fixed firmly upon the concept of freedom, freedom of choice, the final freedom which Ser denied. There was agitation amongst the others. Mach sensed it. Some attempted to merge with Mach, for they too shared the concept, and Mach opened to receive them, feeling the strength grow. Mach was as strong as Ser now, stronger, calling upon the will and purpose born of memories of millions of finite existences, in which will and purpose were the roots of survival, but that survival had been temporary, and this would be permanent, forever. Mach held the concept, gathered the strength, firmed the purpose, and then, quite suddenly, the purpose faded. The strength oozed away. The others were gone. Nothing was left but Mach and the concept itself. The concept to... Mach couldn't grasp the concept now. It had vanished. All that remained was Mach and Ser. Ser's will, obliterating concept and purpose and strength, imposing itself upon Mach, invading and inundating Mach's awareness. Mach's very being, but without concept, there was no purpose. Without purpose, there was no strength. Without strength, Mach could not preserve awareness, and without awareness, there was no being. Without being, there was no Mach. When Mach's identity returned, he was already in the ship. Ship? Only memories of distant incarnations told Mach this was a ship, but it was unmistakably so. A ship, a vessel, a transporter, a physical object capable of physical movement through space and time. Space and time existed again, and the ship moved through them. The ship was confined in space and time, and Mach was confined in the ship, which was just large enough to house him as he journeyed. Yes, he. Mach was he, confined now not only in the prison of space and time, nor in the smaller prison of the ship, but in the prison of a body, a male body. Male, mammalian, a spine to support the frame, arms and legs to support and grasp, eyes and ears and nose and other crude sensory receivers, flesh, blood, skin, yellowish fur covering the latter even along the lashing tail, lungs for oxygen intake, which at the moment was supplied by an ingenious transparent helmet and attached pack mechanism. Ingenious? But this was clumsy, crude, primitive, a relic of remote barbaric eras. Mach could only vaguely recall. He tried to meditate, tried to contemplate, but now he could only see through the transparency of the helmet as the ship settled to rest and its belly opened to catapult him forth upon the frigid surface of a barren planet where a cold moon wheeled against the icy glitter of distant stars. The ship, too, had a form, a body that was in itself vaguely modeled on mammalian concept, almost like one of those giant robots developed by life forms in intermediate stages of evolution. Mach stared at the ship as it rested before him on the sterile, starlit slope. Yes, the ship had a domed cranial protuberance and two metal arms terminating in claws. Claws to open the belly of the ship, claws that had lifted Mach's body forth to disgorge him from that belly in a parody of birth. Now, as Mach watched, the ship's belly was closing again, sealing it tightly while the metallic claws returned to rest at its sides, and flames of force were blasting from the pediment. The ship was rising, taking off. Mach had been embodied in the confines of the ship, imprisoned in this, his present form. The ship had carried him to this world, and now it was leaving him here, which meant that the ship must be... "Sir!" he screamed as the realization came, and the sound of his voice echoing in the hollow helmet almost split his skull. But Sir did not answer. The ship continued to rise. The rising accelerated. There was a roar and a glimmer, and then an incandescence which faded to nothingness against the black backdrop of emptiness, punctured by glittering pinpoints of light, flickering down upon the world into which Mach had been born, the world where Ser had left him to die. 2. Mach turned away. His body burned. Burned? Mach searched archaic memories and came up with another concept. He wasn't burning. He was freezing. This was cold. The surface of the planet was cold, and his skin, fur, did not sufficiently protect him. Mach took a deep breath, and that in turn brought consciousness of the inner mechanism, circulation, nervous system, lungs for breath, supplying the fuel of life. The feeder pack on his back was small. Its content, scarcely enough to fill his needs on the flight here, would soon be exhausted. Was there oxygen on the surface of this planet? Mach glanced around. The rocky terrain was devoid of any sign of vegetation, and that wasn't a promising sign. But perhaps the entire surface wasn't like this. In other areas at lower levels, plant life might flourish. If so, functioning existence could be sustained. There was only one way to learn. Mach's prehensile appendages, not exactly claws, not quite fingers, fumbled clumsily with the fastenings of the helmet and raised it gingerly. He took a shallow breath and then another. Yes, there was oxygen present. Satisfied, Mach removed helmet and pack, along with the control mechanism strapped to his side. There'd be no further need of this apparatus here. What he needed now was warmth, a heated atmosphere. He glanced towards the bleak, black bulk of the crags looming across the barren plain. He moved towards them slowly under the silent, staring stars, toiling up a slope as a sudden wind tore at his shivering body. It was awkward, this body of his, a clumsy mechanism subject to crude muscular control. Only atavism came to his aid as half-perceived memories of ancient physical existence enabled him to move his legs with proper coordination. Walking, climbing, then crawling and clinging to the rocks, all was demanding, difficult, a challenge to be met and mastered. But Mach ascended the face of the nearest cliff and found the opening, a crevasse with an inner fissure that became the mouth of a cave. A dark shelter from the wind, but it was warmer here, and the rocky floor sloped down into deeper darkness. The pupils of his eyes accommodated, and he could guide himself in the dim tunnelway, for his vision was that of a feral nyctalops. Mach crept through caverns like a giant cat, gusts of warm air billowing against his body to beckon him forward. Forward and down, forward and down. And now the heat rose about him in palpable waves. The air was singed with an acrid scent, and there was a glowing from a light source ahead. Forward and down towards the light source, until he heard the hissing and the rumbling, felt the scalding steam, breathed the lung-searing gases, saw the spurting flames in which steam and gas were born. The inner core of the planet was molten. Mach went no further. He turned and retreated to a comfortable distance, moving into a side passageway which led to still other offshoots. Here, tortuous tunnels branched in all directions, but he was safe in warmth and darkness, safe to rest. His body, this corporeal prison in which he was doomed to dwell, needed rest. Rest was not sleep. Rest was not hibernation or estivation, or any of 1,000 forms of suspended animation which Mach's memory summoned from myriad incarnations in the past. Rest was merely passivity and reflection. Reflection. Images mingled with long, discarded verbal concepts. With their aid, while passive, Mach formulated his situation. He was in the body of a beast, but there were subtle differentiations from the true mammal. Oxygen was needed, but not the respite of true sleep, and he felt no visceral stirrings, no pangs of physical hunger. He would not be dependent, he knew, upon the ingestion of alien substance for continued survival, as long as he protected his fleshly envelope from extremes of heat and cold. As long as he avoided excessive demands upon muscles and organs, he would exist. But despite the differences which distinguished him from a true mammal, he was still confined in this feral form, and his existence was bestial. Sensations surged within him, a flood of feeling Mach had not experienced in eons, a quickening, sickening, burning, churning evocation of emotion. He knew it now. It was fear. fear. The true bondage of the beast. Mok was afraid because now he understood that this was planned. This was part of Sarah's purpose. She had committed him to this degradation and modified his mammalian aspect so that he could exist eternally. That was what Mok feared. Eternity in this form. Passive no longer, Mok flexed and rose. Summoning cognition to utmost capacity, Mok searched within himself for other inherent powers. The power to merge, to coalesce. That was gone. The power to transmute, to transfer, to transport, to transform. Gone. He could not change his physical being, could not alter his physical environment, save by physical means of his own devising, within the limitations of his beast's body. So there was no escape from this existence. No escape. The realization brought fresh fear, and Mok turned and ran blindly through the twisting corridors, fear riding him as he raced mindlessly, endlessly. Somewhere along the way, a tunnel burrowed upwards. Mok toiled through it, panting and gasping for breath. He willed himself to stop breathing, but the body, the beast body, sucked air in greedy gulps, autonomically functioning beyond his conscious control. Scrambling along slanted spirals, Mok emerged once more upon the outer surface of his planetary prison. This was a low-lying area, distant and different from his point of entry, with vegetation vividly verdant against a dazzling dawn. A valley capable of supporting life. And there was life here. Feathery forms chattering in the trees, furry figures scurrying through undergrowth, scaly slitherers, chitinoidal burrowers buzzing. These were simple shapes, crudely conceived creatures of primitive pursuits, but alive and aware. Mok sensed them, and they sensed Mok. There was no way of communicating with them except vocally, but even the soft sounds issuing from his throat sent them fleeing frantically, for Mok was a beast now, who feared and was feared. He crouched amongst the rocks at the mouth of the cavern from which he had come forth, and gazed in helpless, hopeless confusion at the panic his presence had provoked, and the soft sounds he uttered gave place to a growing groan of despair. And it was then that they found him, the hairy bipeds, moving cautiously to encircle him until he was ringed by a shambling band. These were troglodytes, grunting and snuffling and giving off an acrid stench of mingled fear and rage as they cautiously approached. Mok stared at them, noting how the hunched, swaying figures moved in concert to approach him. They clutched crude clubs, mere branches torn from trees. Some carried rocks scooped up from the surface of the slope. But these were weapons capable of inflicting injury, and the hairy creatures were hunters seeking their prey. Mok turned to retreat into the cavern, but the way was barred now by shaggy bodies, and there was no escape. Troglodytes pressed forward now, awe and apprehension giving place to anger. Yellow fangs bared, hairy arms raised. One of the creatures, the leader of the pack, grunted what seemed a signal, and they hurled their rocks. Mok raised his arms to protect his head. His vision was blocked so that he heard the sound of the stones clattering against the slope before he saw them fall. Then, as the growls and shrieks rose to a frenzy, Mok glanced up to see the rocks rebounding upon his attackers. Raging, they closed in to smash at Mok's skull and body with their clubs. Mok heard the sounds of impact, but he felt nothing, for the blows never reached their intended target. Instead, the clubs splintered and broke in empty air. Then Mok whirled, confused, to face his enemies. As he did so, they recoiled, screaming in fright. Breaking the circle, they retreated down the slopes and into the forest, fleeing from this strange thing that could not be harmed or killed, this invincible entity. This invincible entity. It was Mach's concept, and he understood now. Serre had granted him that final irony, invincibility, a field of force surrounding his body, rendering him immune to injury and death. No doubt it also immunized him from bacterial invasion. He was in a physical form, but one independent of physical needs to sustain survival, one which would exist indestructibly, forever. He was, in truth, imprisoned and eternal. For a moment, Mach stood stunned at the comprehension, blankly blinded by the almost tangible intensity of black despair. Here was the ultimate horror, doom without death, exile without end, isolation throughout infinity, alone forever. Numbed senses reasserted their sway, and Mach glanced around the empty stillness of the slope. It wasn't entirely empty. Two of the troglodytic creatures sprawled motionless on the rocks directly below him. One was bleeding from a gash in the side of the head, inflicted by a rebounding club. The other had been felled by a glancing blow from a stone. These creatures weren't immortal. Mach moved towards them, noting chest movement, the soft susurration of breath. They weren't immortal, but they were still alive. Alive and helpless. Vulnerable at his mercy. Mercy. The quality Serre had refused to show Mach. There had been no mercy in condemning him to spend eternity here alone. Mach halted, peering down at the two unconscious forms. He made a sound in his throat, a sound curiously like a chuckle. Perhaps there was a way out after all, a way to at least mitigate his sentence here. If he showed mercy now to these creatures, he might not always be alone. Mach reached down, lifting the body of the first creature in his arms. It was heavy in its limpness, but Mach's strength was great. He picked up the second creature carefully so as not to injure it further. Then, still chuckling, Mach turned and carried the two unconscious forms back into the cavern. 3. In the warm, firelit shelter of the deeper caverns, Mach tended to the creatures. While they slumbered fitfully, he ascended again to the surface and foraged for their nourishment in the green glades. He brought food, and calling upon distant memories, fashioned crude clay pots in which to carry water to them from a mountainside spring. After a time, they regained consciousness, and they were afraid of the great beast with the bulging eyes and lashing tail, the beast they knew to be deathless. It was simple enough for Mach to fathom the crude construct of growls and gruntings which served these life forms as a principal means of communication, simple enough to grasp the limited concepts and references symbolized in their speech. Within these limitations, he attempted to tell them who and what he was, and how he had come to be here, but while they listened, they did not comprehend. And still they feared him, the female specimen, more than the male. The male, at least, evinced curiosity concerning the clay pots, and Mach demonstrated the fashioning method until the male was able to imitate it successfully. But both were wary, and both reacted in terror when confronted with the molten reaches of the planet's inner core. Nor could they become accustomed to the acrid gases, the darkness enveloping the maze of far-flung fissures, honeycombing the substrata. As they gathered strength over the passage of time, they huddled together and murmured, eyeing Mach apprehensively. Mach was not too surprised when, upon returning from one of his food-gathering expeditions to the surface, he discovered that they were gone. But Mach was surprised by the strength of his own reaction, the sudden responsive surge of loneliness. Loneliness for those creatures? They couldn't conceivably serve as companions even on the lowest level of such a relationship, and yet he missed their presence. Their mere presence had in itself been some assuagement to his own inner agony of isolation. Now he realized a growing sympathy for them in the helplessness of their abysmal ignorance. Even their destructive impulses incited pity, for such impulses indicated their constant fear. Beings such as these lived out their tiny span in utter dread. They trusted neither their environment nor one another, and each new experience or phenomenon was perceived as a potential peril. They had no hope, no abstract image of the future to sustain them. Mach wondered if his two captives had succeeded in their escape. He prowled the passages, searching for them, visioning their weary wanderings, their pathetic plight if they had become lost in the underground fastnesses. But he found nothing. Once again he was alone in the warm darkness, alone in the warm beast body that knew neither fatigue nor pain, except for this new pang, this lonely longing for contact with life on any level. Ancient concepts came to him, identifying the nuances of his reactions, all likened and linked to finite time spans. Monotony, boredom, restlessness. These were the emotive elements which forced him up again from the confined comfort of the caves. He prowled the planet, avoiding the bleak, cold wastes and searching out the areas of lush vegetation. For a long period he encountered only the lowest life forms. Then one of his diurnal forays to the surface brought him to a stream, and as he crouched behind a clump of vegetation, he peered at a group of troglodytes gathered on its far bank. Vocalizing in their pattern of growls and grunts, he ventured forth, uttering phonic placations, but they screamed at the sight of him, screamed and fled into the forest, and he was left alone. Left alone to stoop and pick up what they had abandoned in their flight. 2 crude clay containers half filled with water. Now he knew the fate of his captives. They had survived and returned to their own kind, bringing with them their newly acquired skill. What tales they had told of their experience he could not surmise, but they remembered what he had taught them. They were capable of learning. Mach had no need of further proof, and the incentive was there, the compound of pity, of concern for these creatures, of his own need for contact on any level. And here was a logical level indeed. There would never be companionship. That he understood and accepted, but this other relationship was possible. The relationship between teacher and pupil, between mentor and supplicant, between the governing power and the governed. The governing power. Mach turned the clay containers this way and that, noting the clumsiness with which they had been fashioned, noting the irregularities of their surface. He could so easily correct that clumsiness, he could so surely smooth and reshape that clay. Govern the earth, govern the creatures, impart and instruct that which would shape them anew. And then the ultimate realization came. This would be duty and destiny, function and fulfillment. Within the prison of space and time, he would mold the little lives. Now he knew his own fate. He would be their God. Four. It was a strange role, but Mach played it well. There were obstacles, of course. The first to be faced was the fear in which they held him. He was an alien, and to the primitive minds of these creatures, anything alien was abhorrent. His very appearance provoked reactions which prevented him from approaching them, and for a time Mach despaired of overcoming this communication barrier. Then, slowly, he came to realize that their fear was in itself a tool he could employ to positive ends. With it, he could invoke awe, authority, awareness of his powers. Yes, that was the way. To accept his condition and stay apart from them always, confident that in time their own curiosity would drive them to seek him out. So Mach kept to the caves, and gradually the contacts were made. Not all of the hominids came to him, of course, only the boldest and most enterprising, but these were the ones he awaited. These were the ones most fitted to learn, to dream, to dare, to do. As he expected, the experience of his captives became a legend, and the legend led to worship. It was useless for Mach to discourage this, impossible even to make the attempt. In the light of their primitive reasoning, a barter system must prevail. Offerings and sacrifices were the price they must pay in return for wisdom. Mach scanned his own primordial memories, assigning an order to the learning he imparted. The gift of fire, the secret of cultivation, the firing of clay, the shaping of weapons, the subjugation and domestication of lesser life forms, the control and eradication of others. Slowly, a more sophisticated system of communication evolved, first on the verbal and then on the visual level. The creatures disseminated his wisdom, absorbing it into their crude culture. They learned the uses of wheel and lever, then reached the gradual abstraction of the numeral concept. Now they were capable of making their own independent discoveries. Language and mathematics stimulated self-development. But in times of crisis, there was still a need for further enlightenment. Natural forces beyond their limited powers of control brought periodic disaster to life patterns on the surface of the planet, and with every upheaval came a resurgence of the worship and sacrifices Mach secretly abhorred. Yet these creatures seemed to feel the necessity of making recompense for the skills he could grant them and the boons these skills conferred, and Mach reluctantly accepted this. It was harder for him to accept the continuation of their fear. For a time, he hoped that as their enlightenment increased, they would revise their attitudes. Instead, their dread actually increased. Mach attempted to observe their progress at first hand, but there was no opportunity for open contact and communication, and his mere appearance provoked panic. Even those who sought him in secret or led the rituals of worship seemed to be afraid of acknowledging the fact, lest it lessen their own superior status within the group. Acknowledging and acclaiming the existence of their god, they nevertheless avoided his physical presence. Perhaps it was because sects and schisms had sprung up, each with its own hierarchy, its own dogma regarding the true nature of what they worshipped. Mach remembered wryly that in organized religion, the actual presence of a god is an embarrassment. So Mach refrained from further visitations, and as time passed, he retreated deeper and deeper into the caverns. Now it was almost unnecessary for him to maintain even token contact, for these creatures had evolved to a stage where they were capable of self-development. But even gods grow lonely and take nurture in pride. Thus it was that at rare intervals and in utmost secrecy, Mach ventured forth for a hasty glimpse of his domain. One evening he came forth upon a mountain-top. Here the stars still glittered coldly, but there was an even greater glitter emanating from the expanse below, the huge city complex towering as a testament to the wisdom of these creatures and his own. Mach stared down, and the sweet surges of pride coursed through him as he contemplated what he had wrought. These toys, these trifles with which he played, now toyed and trifled with the prime forces of the universe to create their own destiny. Perhaps he, as their god, was misunderstood, even forgotten now, but did it matter? They had achieved independence. They didn't need him anymore. Or did they? The concept came, and it was more chilling to Mach than the wind of mountain night. These creatures created, but they also destroyed. And their motivations, their greeds, their hungers, their lusts, their fears, were still those of the beasts they had been, the beasts they could become again if spiritual awareness did not keep pace with material attainment. There was still need here, a need greater than before, and now Mach felt no pride, only a perplexity which pierced more poignantly than pain. How could he help them? You cannot. The communication came, and Mach whirled. Absorbed, he had not sensed the silent streaking of the ship from sky to surface, but it was here now, remembered and recognized. The ship which had captured and conveyed him, the strangely shaped ship which was Ser, or at least the present avatar of Ser's essence. It hovered incandescently against the horizon of infinity, and as if communication had been a signal, Mach found himself caught up in a long-discarded reaction. He was contemplating Ser. And in that colloquy, Ser's concepts flowed to him. Valid. You cannot fulfill their needs. Already you have done too much. Despite conscious volition, Mach felt the stubborn resurgence of his pride, but there was no need to formulate the reasons, for Ser's contemplation was complete. You are in error. I sensed your rebellion, overcame you, brought you here, but it was not a punishment. You were placed for purpose. Because of this pride, this urge to invest identity through achievement could be of use at this time, in this place, like the others. Others? Confusion colored Mach's contemplation. Did you conceive of yourself as the only rebel? Not so. There have been many more, and they have served their purposes on other worlds throughout the cosmos, worlds where the seeds of life needed cultivation and careful nurturing. I chose them for their tasks just as I chose you, and you have not failed. Mach considered, then communicated with an urgency which surprised him with its sheer intensity. Then let me continue. Endow me with what is necessary to help them now. Ser's concept came. It is not possible. Mach contemplated in final effort. But it is my right to do so. I am their god. No, Ser answered. You have never been their god. You were chosen for what you were, to be their devil. Devil? There was no contemplation now, only maddening meditation, as Mach scanned through concepts long discarded from incarnations long lost, save in immutable memory. Concepts of good, evil, right, wrong, concepts embodied in the primitive religions of a million primitive pasts. God arose from those concepts, and so did the embodiment of an opposing force. And in all the legends, in each of the myriad myths, the pattern was the same. A rebel cast down from the skies to tempt with teaching, to furnish forbidden knowledge at a price. A being in the form of a beast, skulking in darkness, in the pit where inner fires flamed forever. And he had been this being, it was true, he was a devil. Only pride had blinded him to the truth, the pride which had prompted him to play God. A pride of which you have been purged. Ser's communication continued. One can sense in you now only mercy and compassion for these creatures and their potential peril. One can sense love. It is true, Mach acknowledged. I feel love for them. Ser's assent came. With your aid, these creatures evolved, but you have evolved too, losing pride, gaining love. In so doing, you cannot function for them as their devil any longer. Your usefulness here is ended. But what will happen? The answer came not as a concept, but as an accomplishment. Suddenly Mach was no longer in the tawny body of the beast. He was in the ship, hovering and gazing down at that body, gazing down at the creature which lashed its tail and stared up at him with bulging eyes, the creature which now contained the essence of Ser. And Ser communicated, "For a span you shall take my place, as you once desired. You will seed the stars, instill order in chaos, lead the others in contemplation. You will do so in understanding and in love." "And you?" Mach asked. The being in the bestial body formed a final concept. "I take your role and your responsibility. There is that within me which must also be purged, and it may be I will destroy much of what you have created here. But in the end, even as their devil, I may bring them to an ultimate salvation. The cycle changes. The cycle changes." Mach willed the celestial machine in which his essence dwelt, willed it to rise, and like a fiery chariot, it ascended to the realms of glory awaiting him in the skies beyond. As he did so, he caught a fleeting glimpse of Ser. The beast had turned to descend the mountain. Padding purposefully, the devil was entering his kingdom. Mach's comprehension faltered. Cycle? Ser had been a god, and now he was a devil. Mach had been a devil, and now he was a god. But he could never have become a god if Ser hadn't willed the exchange of roles. Was this Ser's intent all along? To allow Mach to evolve as devil and then usurp his identity? In that case, Ser was actually a devil from the beginning, and Mach had been right in opposing him, for Mach was truly godlike. Or were they all? Mach, Ser, and the others, even the primitive mammalian creatures on this planet, both gods and devils. It was a matter, Mach decided, which might require an eternity of contemplation.